My name is Rachel Frei. I am with the Natural Resources Conservation Service as South Dakota's Urban Conservationist. I'm located out of our Sioux Falls office, but I service our whole state. I'm kind of a one-person show. And you'll be able to hear a little bit more about my position, about what we're doing in NRCS as well as USDA in our presentation. And I'm joined here with Daryl Duvall, who I will let him introduce himself.
Hello everyone, Daryl Duvall. I also work for NRCS. As Rachel might allude, we're going to talk a little more about a few other USDA programs. But my title right now is Outreach Coordinator, work with partnerships and other projects. And since I got the microphone, I'd just like to talk about myself a little bit. And I did, in 2012, put up a high tunnel, and that was some carrots I pulled out in December. And this last year, we had to rebuild it. I did plant a cover crop in half of it, a lot of oats and the flax and such. And that picture on the right was about a month ago or 3 weeks ago. So you see it's dried up there. That stuff on the left-hand side is cover crop. On the right-hand side of my nephew there is our last year's little bit of garden stuff after it got flooded out earlier of some cabbage you see on the bottom and other plants. I was going to plan to put the sheep in there this year, but as you see the one drift on the one end I have open, the cat made it in, that's about it. So I've been spending a little extra on hay this year, and I just feed them by hand. The 40 head of ewes, throw the hay up against a cattle panel, and then that's how this year I don't have corn stalks to put them on or wheat stubble very easily. So NRCS employee, live in the Chamberlain area. I work out of our state office in Huron.
Wonderful. As for my expertise, I know a lot about how to grow things, but when it comes down to it, I can kill a tomato plant really quickly. So I can't say I have quite a green thumb. Oh yeah, I'll take the clicker. So I have a lot of familiar faces in the room, which is wonderful. But for those that may not know me or I don't know you, who is familiar with the NRCS? Raise your hand. Good. Right. So I like to break it down because not everyone is familiar with NRCS, especially when we move into our urban producers. They have often been out of the conversation when it comes to conservation, when it comes to ag. So under the USDA, we have our Secretary of Ag, which is Vilsack, and then NRCS is located right down here under our Farm Production and Conservation branch. So we are also together with Risk Management, who does crop insurance, and the Farm Service Agency, which does a lot of farm loans for ag. With NRCS, we are on the conservation side. So our mission, or our vision, our goal is helping people help the land. And we do that through creating a sustainable agriculture future. So not only do we want to sustain your farm economically, but we want to sustain it environmentally as well. And it's all voluntary cost share conservation programs. You walk into our office, I'm really curious in cover crops. I want to build my organic matter, and I heard you could help us with that. That's typically how a lot of conversations start with us. We have offices in 99% of counties nationwide. That 1% covers the counties that are often covered by one office. So one office, two counties. And we span all different types of agriculture subjects. I think a lot of people might not know that we have soil scientists on staff. We have economists on staff. We have agronomists on staff. So why pay for a third party to do that for you when NRCS can offer that assistance completely for free? And then our most well-known is probably our cost share financial programs. So that is assistance financially to help fund conservation on your land. One of our most well-known programs is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. That's much like our foundational program. If you're building a house, you have to have the foundation first before you can build the walls and the structure up top. The Conservation Stewardship Program, as well as easements, emergency assistance, all fall under NRCS. And then we also have our Conservation Reserve Program. Not necessarily our program, but we help technically with that. So every now and then we like to claim it. But that's kind of us. So after I've said all of that, there's a small catch, right? EQIP, financial assistance, cover crops, crop rotation, all the different types of conservation we can do on your land. We do traditionally on larger scale operations. And it's kind of by the nature of it. We do it to large scale operations because those are the people that have traditionally come to us. We're often in rural spaces, so we see a lot of large scale commercial ag. But that is changing, I'm very happy to say, and USDA is seeing an opportunity within the urban realm. So, does anyone know what USDA defines as a farm? Yeah, you could say that. So, USDA defines a farm as any place that produces and sells or would normally produce and sell at least $1,000 of value in a given year. So, when you think of that, all of a sudden, there's a lot of farms all over the U.S. And I like to ask people, who here likes tomatoes? Who likes salsa? Pickles? Salad? Maybe not everyone. And so we have to think, well, where do those come from? Maybe they're not coming from a $5,000 acre farm, but they have to come from somewhere. And those people are seeking assistance just like our $5,000 farms are. They have soil health concerns. They're curious about crop rotation or mulching to increase organic matter. So why should we leave them out? And that's kind of a big priority that USDA is now moving towards, is expanding our practices and our programs across all of our agencies in USDA to provide equitable access to programs and cost share and assistance to our small-scale producers, just as much as we do with our larger-scale traditional agriculture producers. So urban is kind of thrown around, and honestly, it's the easiest way to describe it. But when you think of urban in South Dakota, you giggle. And I'm an urban conservationist in South Dakota. I've had the chief of NRCS laugh at me and ask me what I do. I said, well, let me tell you. So at the USDA level, they've not defined what urban is. They don't want to define it because once you define it, somebody's going to be left out. And the whole purpose of creating equitable access is to make sure everyone has a fair advantage. So urban is used as an umbrella term, right? It's a simple way to say small scale, specialty producers, tomatoes, lettuce, cucumbers, etc. Even small livestock production, those that are doing it for wool or fiber, cut flowers and honey production, orchards, vineyards, and even those that are hobby farmers or subsistence farmers that are purely just growing food for their family. So when I do talk about urban, know that I'm talking about all of these things. We don't have size limitations. We don't have a systems requirement. We don't care necessarily if you sell your food at the farmer's market or if you eat it yourself. Everyone is kind of welcomed. We have conversations on what potentially we could do with your land to increase your sustainability. So within USDA, they created the Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production. This is a standalone office that's housed within NRCS, and they are the driving force within prioritizing urban ag in USDA. So the Office of Urban Ag, they're roughly new. They were included in the 2018 Farm Bill, and since then they've really hit the ground running with creating an initiative that can be intra-agency. So one of the big things they have an FSA urban and suburban county committees. There's 17 of these across the U.S., and they are a sounding board for the community to provide input on what's going on in their communities, what could be improved within USDA programs, what are our barriers within agriculture and urban growing, et cetera, et cetera. They also have a federal advisory committee, which meets quarterly, and they actually use those recommendations and community input to make direct recommendations to Secretary Vilsack in terms of what regulations he can control within the USDA. And those meetings are actually public. So if you're ever curious what's going on within urban ag, you can go on to USDA Urban Ag, Google it, and you'll be able to get to the Urban Ag page to find those meetings. They're very interesting to listen to. They're about 2 hours. And it's just interesting to see ag from a very different perspective than perhaps what we're used to in South Dakota. Along with our FSA committees, they also have 17 urban hubs nationwide. I believe our closest one is in Minneapolis. But again, these are a start to us expanding our resources and our assistance nationwide and providing a place for communities to input what could we change and improve. We also have the People's Garden Initiative. We have 17 recognized People's Gardens in these 17 urban hubs. I tried very hard to get one in South Dakota, but I was unsuccessful. But the great thing with the People's Garden Initiative is you can actually self-certify a garden as long as it falls under the qualifications of what a people's garden is. So a community gathering space, something available for all peoples to come and be a part of the initiative. Then you can have a USDA People's Garden. They send you a sign. I believe there's over 200 certified nationwide. So it's maybe not helping your garden, but it's just a fun thing that's kind of going on. Through the Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Productions, they also have 2 grant programs that have been really, really successful. The first one is composting and food waste reduction agreements. And this grant program is recognizing that within our whole food system, growing food is only part of the process. We have food that goes to waste because it's ugly. We have food that is not eaten when it's served. Food that never even makes your plate. So this grant program is offered for tribal entities and governments to establish trial composting systems in their cities or in their towns and can hit at any point of that composting system. So that can even be procurement of ugly fruits and vegetables that would save them from ever becoming composted before getting eaten. That grant program is currently open. So if you are a part of a city or a community that might want to consider some type of initiative, I recommend going forth. The other one is Urban Ag and Innovative Production Grants. These are for nonprofits, government entities, tribal entities, schools, churches, etc. They are funding urban ag and innovative production projects. Anything from school gardens to community gardens to doing market research on if a garden in the city would be applicable, or research onto food aggregation in a community. So they have planning and implementation types depending at what part in your project you're looking for. I've been a grant reviewer for this program, and the projects are really varied and just really wonderful. They all are looking to combat food accessibility, which is one of the priorities with this grant, is looking at food desert areas and how we can make food accessibility in food deserts more accessible. For For the 22 season, this grant awarded $14.2 million of investments. I believe going into 23, I want to say that it's $9 million that they have in grant funding, but don't quote me on that. But if you go to the Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Productions website, you can actually see all of the funded grants that they did, read about the projects, and that's a great way to see what's going around nationwide. We do have a few applicants that I'm aware of in South Dakota that are applying for these grants. So cross our fingers that we could get some exposure through them. With this program as well, there's upwards of a $350,000 ceiling. So they can be pretty large projects, increasing food accessibility. Are there any questions so far? You have a question? No, okay. So there's a lot of other agencies and USDA that are changing the game. And I'll run through these briefly, and Daryl's going to talk a little bit further in depth. With NRCS, we have our Conservation Innovative Grants, also known as CIGs or SIGs. So in the process of developing urban practices, I recognize that NRCS doesn't have all the answers, right? There's limitations to what we can do on a farm. And I've had a lot of creative ideas that I've never even heard about. Heating your water tank with compost. And I thought to myself, how would you even do that? And there's research on it, which is wonderful. But we don't have an assistance program that could help with that. Right? And we don't know a lot about it to possibly justify those dollars to that practice. So CIG is a great program where a producer can come in, have a crazy idea, an innovative idea, a unique idea, and we can help fund that. We help fund your labor, your construction costs, your materials, and in return, you're going to give us research. You're going to tell us how much it costed you, what was the management like, how successful was your project. And the hope is that we get good information back from you and it was successful, so then we can one day look at making it a practice nationwide. So we are going to be releasing our CIGs hopefully soon. It is a competitive program, but if you have an idea that perhaps we can assist with, but you're curious about doing it, contact me, contact your local office, and get a little bit more information. Like I said, this is going to be coming out relatively soon. I don't know the exact date, but it's a great opportunity. And when I think of greenhouse in the snow, I've had people ask me, can I bury my greenhouse? And I say, well, I don't know if we can do that yet, but do this CIG and let us know how successful it was. So perhaps one day we can cost share you to bury your greenhouse. We also have a big focus moving forward with climate smart agriculture. Those are coming from our Inflation Reduction Act bill and money for that. With Farm Service Agency, they have microloans specifically geared towards small-scale producers. They also have cold storage facility loans, which often people don't know about, but it's often a number one issue I find with specialty producers is they don't have enough cold storage. There's also micro farm insurance through our risk management agency. That covers your whole farm up to $350,000. Comprehensive, they don't necessarily go by crop. It's just a full blanket coverage for your farm. And I do have some information on that if anyone is interested. There is also the farm to school programs through the Food and Nutrition Service and the Agriculture Marketing Service, all about procuring local food for schools, doing school gardens for schools, as well as buying any type of kitchen appliances or materials that would be needed in the schools to incorporate more local foods into their diets. And also with Agriculture Marketing Service, they have paired up with our State Department and Feeding South Dakota to do a local foods purchasing program. A big question I get asked with specialty producers as well as our field offices and NRCS is, my producer doesn't know what to do with their production. They don't quite know where to sell it to, who they could sell it to. They're afraid they don't have enough to keep a supply up to meet a demand. And so there's tons of resources out there through other agencies like the Farm to School program where, confront a school, see if they want to buy your zucchinis. And then now with our State Department, all about a direct market to Feeding South Dakota. So producers are going to be feeding local South Dakota residents. I also like to talk about the REAP program, Rural Energy for America program, which gives renewable energies to small-scale businesses, which can include our small-scale specialty producers as well. This is a 25% grant program, and then you cover the remaining $75 costs. But these can include solar panels, geothermal energies, wind turbines, obviously not the huge ones, the ones that can go in your backyard, but are really a good information there. And there's a lot more, but I'm also going to let Daryl talk a little bit more in depth about some of the other programs.
Thank you, Rachel. No, I'm not going to be more in depth than that, but I do want to talk about, so every one of these bullets that's on this screen, except for maybe the very bottom one, I wanted to share is in here, and that's why I wanted to hand this out. Even if we're not a brand new producer, brand new to NRCS, or a so-called historically underserved, this is a great tool to use to reference back and see what's going to happen, or get familiar with the with terminology that's used in this world. One, I just want to add that so I had some pages marked. But if you look through, like Farm Service Agency, page 7 talks a little bit about the loans, and also at the bottom, page 7, rural development. Rural development is not a member of this FPAC mission area, but we even talk about rural development a little bit in this handout as having additionally value-added grants for adding that second stage to your product or for expanding markets. And so I wanted to so that page 14, Rachel talked about the microloans from FSA. Microloans are highlighted on page 14. Again, if you can leave these here if you don't want them, but there's a great tool to take with you, and we have more. Rachel talked about the cold storage facility loans on page 15 is highlighted there. We talked a little bit about the crop insurance, and she talked about the micro farm program where that is not based on a crop. That's on page 24, 25. And so again, that one works through risk management agency, but you go to the local crop insurance agents, and it's based on last year's or previous year's income statements. If this is your baseline, then they insure it based on that baseline rather than so many dollars per pound or bushel of carrots and such and such. So if you're looking for insurance to help with those specialty crop productions, there's where we talk about that on that page. And Rachel visited a little bit on the Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production on that page 26. Most importantly, also, there's some pages in there that talks about the NRCS's planning process, where we talk about what the needs are and who's going to do what, when, where, how, and why are we doing this, whatever this is, whether it's a cover crop or a high tunnel or nutrient management in our small scale or large scale efforts. We go through that process of what's the needs of the ground, what do we need to do to improve or manage that carbon or organic matter or life in the soil or the grasses, health of the plants. Go through that planning process, which is in there. I don't remember the pages on that, but that's really important tips. So when you go into that NRCS office or the FSA, you take that back home with you and you hear that terminology. I just think this is a great handout for helping refer back to what's said and what's going on, especially when you get into the contract stage if you deal with a contract with NRCS.
Back to the green, or to the honeybees on page 14. Let's say if you want to extend the building or something, is there a program of that?
So it's really easy for me to say it's eligible for different USDA programs because a lot of all this stuff is, but it's all competitive. So NRCS would not have financial assistance for that particular example. I would certainly sit down and talk to Farm Service Agency about a loan for that, and maybe the rural development, which contacts are in the book, and then decide if you want to go through the process of applying and how the competitive process works. So I'm sorry, but yes, it's eligible. Would it be funded? Don't know.
So what would we have to do to find out if it is funded?
I can hook you up with the right person, and we can ask. It's be eligible, but whether during that competition phase of that yearly funding cycle, usually, then it's, okay, which ones are going to be, how do they rank out to fund until they run out of funding? So we should visit on this to make sure we get you hooked up with the right persons, either at our Huron state offices with those two offices, or locally to talk more and fill out get that application process of what, when, who, how, and why, and those questions developed.
For new growers, so this will be my first year growing fresh cut flowers and maybe some vegetables, but I haven't sold anything yet. So what do you do in situations like mine that we're just like brand new? Like, who do I need to talk to and get that knowledge or help or?
So, as Rachel indicated, there's a lot of different stuff here. So one would be working with that local NRCS office and then the contacts they have to talk about soil structure, life in the soil, no-till crops. But then if you want to get into crop insurance, yeah, we'd have to, I don't know the specifics on what it would take to get the micro farm insurance if you'd even be eligible the first year. So do you have any other specific questions?
No, just everything I've been doing research on. You each have like 3 years experience and plus be able to get any sort of help. So I'm like, I'm by myself for 3 years.
Sometimes. I did get a new beginning farmer land loan and was able to show that I kind of knew what I was doing to qualify as a beginning farmer in 2009. I didn't have any years of experience. So it just takes that communication and that conversation. NRCS does not have a 3-year, but we've never heard of that at NRCS. Oh, some of the grants and stuff, yep.
And we can talk to you afterwards just to explore things. So with NRCS, as a beginning farmer, meaning that you've not claimed agriculture income for 10 years, you do have some advantages as you're recognized as being newer, being a little bit not disadvantaged necessarily, but you're coming in there, you might need a little bit more assistance. So there definitely are programs in place to help new and beginning producers. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I forgot. One of the hats I wear is a beginning farmer coordinator with NRCS, and we work with these other agencies we talked about. So as far as beginning farmer, I do have contacts for that beginning farmer person with the 4 agencies, Farm Service Agency and Rural Development and Risk Management Agency, and then me with NRCS.
Great. Are there any other questions so far? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he's asking about the pest management, and I will talk a little bit about practices, but to touch on pest management, it is a practice that we cost share, given that you are interested in increasing the management of your pests. And typically our pest management is going into your field. You're taking regular scouting records, so walking in your field, looking at what type of disease, pests, weeds are there. And then we base our recommendations off of SDSU, our land-grant university. So if you have so many grasshoppers in a square foot, then we would recommend then a course of action to take care of that. When we work with pest management, we try to focus on integrated pest management with chemical application as our last. If that's always followed like that, it depends on the producer sometimes. But we try to focus on other ways that we can be controlling pests. So cleaning your machinery, really understanding what is a threshold and what is going to be economic disaster to your crops. And then, of course, doing chemical application, but also making sure you're not over applying those chemicals. So, yeah. Yeah.
You talk about pest management. Let's say you have 5 acres of garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that include things like deer and wildlife and things like that?
So one thing I'll touch on later, but I'll just do it now. So traditionally, we've always done our practices large scale, and that means large scale production, large scale solutions. And when we think about adopting those on small scale, it doesn't always work, right? For a 1,000-acre field, a few deer is not a problem. For a 5-acre field, a few deer is a very large problem. And it's yet to be something that NRCS particularly has not had to deal with. And somebody once told me that it's not about adopting practices, it's about adapting them, right? So what a large-scale producer adopts, a small-scale producer cannot necessarily adopt the same thing. We have to adapt it. So a big thing that I am doing as an urban conservationist for the state is looking at all of our practices in NRCS and figuring out how we adapt those to small-scale scenarios. And it's not always easy. Nutrient management in particular is one that we are a little stumped on because we can tell you exactly what your prescription should be for NP and K on a soybean field. But we don't quite know all the answers to fertilizing tomatoes and cucumbers versus your lettuce, compost versus manure compost, etc. So when it comes to pest management, we're also seeing different hurdles that we've not had before. Animals are going to be one of them. I'm also encountering a lot of producers that don't want to use any chemicals at all. And coming from an agency where chemical usage has historically been very high, how do we control pests without chemicals? And how do we educate our staff and other producers on different ways to control pests without chemicals? And so it is all about adapting to fit the needs of our producers. It's about relearning sometimes our very basic theories and solutions. We also have lots of documentation, just the nature of the beast. And a lot of our documents aren't adapted yet to small scale, right? There's not an option to say a deer is a pest of mine. So it's also adapting what our documents look like so we can actually document that deer is a problem and a gopher, that one gopher is a problem. So I've asked for lots of patience because it's not something we're going to solve overnight. But we always need a starting point, you know, and I've definitely tried to get out to our offices and tell them, you know, at the very least, write it down. If there's not a box to check, create a box and we'll adapt as we go, right? Because it's really all a learning process with kind of developing urban ag in USDA and in South Dakota. So did that answer your question? The nice thing is we can fence out your gardens. and help cost share it if pests and deer are a concern or are harming your garden. So at that very least, we can help fence them out. Yeah. 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 Exactly. Great. Any other questions? Good. So this is just a very quick kind of social look at urban ag. And I kind of asked myself, well, why now, right? Growing food in your backyard is not a new thing. People have been doing it for a long time. We were once gatherers in the fields and not necessarily farmers. And so what I found when I did a little bit of research is that often food movements are social responses to large-scale crisis. And in history, we very well know these as victory gardens, where we have a war overseas, we're running out of resources, and so the government tells people, hey, grow in your backyard. And so incredibly successful in World War I, 528 million pounds of food was grown from 5 million gardens. And then later in World War II, half of the country's produce was grown from 20 million gardens. And when you think of gardens, it really is just that, a small 200 square foot plot in your backyard, except there was 20 million of them. So when I think about, well, can we really feed people off of a backyard garden? It's like, well, we can. And that's exactly where your tomatoes are coming from. That's salsa on your nacho chips tonight, right? They don't just appear. Somebody has to be growing them. We also see a lot of food movements through civil rights and grassroots movements for underserved communities, and even beautification in cities, that we want the city to look nicer. It's been researched that crime rates fall when there's more green spaces, which, yeah, people want to keep their cities better, freer, cleaner. And they also provide equity and opportunity. So a lot of urban spaces often have higher immigrant populations. So being able to provide spaces for that type of culture to manifest and grow is another way that food movements have helped in larger scale crises. I also like to look at this very briefly, equity versus equality. And so NRCS, we've offered programs, and you could say that they've all been relatively equal. We are not going to exclude somebody because they have 1 year of experience versus 20. And if you want cover crops, you can have cover crops, right? So we're all going to be standing on a cover crop box. But when we pay $10 an acre for cover crops, and you have 1,000 square feet of a garden, all of a sudden that 10-acre payment is not affording you your seed. So a big part of my position in looking at accessibility with our programs and our practices is how can we make them equitable so everyone can get the benefit of cover crops equally, but how you get there just looks a little bit different. And when it comes to cover crops, we have now adapted a square footage payment to cover crops. So someone with 1,000 square foot acre garden is now going to be relatively in the same ballpark for cost share as somebody who's doing it on an acre basis for 1,000 acre field. This is also done with many other practices that we have, including crop rotation, pest management, nutrient management. We also have micro irrigation cost share as well. So looking at irrigation on a square footage basis, and many, many more. Some practices, like a fence, for instance, doesn't need a small scale payment because we're already paying by the foot, right? But it's an opportunity for someone to look at fence, not for livestock, but for fencing out that pesky deer from your garden. So not only is it a physical adaptation of our payments, but also sometimes a change of perspective on how we can actually use these practices. So what's happening at NRCS? Well, first off, urban conservationist myself. This was a position created in August, and actually most states are hiring on at least one urban conservationist. Nebraska recently hired, Montana has somebody, Minnesota has 2, so it's happening all over. Which I think is great. It's growing a lot of momentum. It's manifesting. I couldn't ask for anything better. We also have lots of partnerships, agreements, and grants that we're growing. So this conference specifically was funded through an agreement with South Dakota SPA to increase our education within urban initiatives in USDA, to get education out there for both our employees as well as our producers statewide. And then I also talked about the Conservation Innovative Grants, which is going to be prioritizing urban-related projects. So another great one. We also have statewide collaborations. So a big part of my job right off the bat was just figuring out who's all in this game. And what I found was there's so many that I had to write people down. And then, if only I had a yearbook and I had a picture. But I've worked a lot with SDSU Extension. I've worked a lot with the city of Sioux Falls, with our conservation districts that are through our state department. I've also worked with Daner, our South Dakota Local Foods Coalition, SPA, an urban ag coalition in Sioux Falls. The list kind of goes on. And one big thing I found is that people just like that somebody in a federal position is represented. This group of specialty producers have long gone unrepresented in state level and federal level programs. And so people would just love if I could sit in the back and maybe say, hey, I'm NRCS. Because they want that representation for their stakeholders and their producers. We're also going to be introducing urban ag and small-scale trainings. In my visits with different field offices, we do have a lack of knowledge when it comes to when do you plant a tomato, and I had no idea asparagus were perennials. And frankly, I didn't know myself until like a year ago. But so there's definitely some education and some growth that we have throughout our agency. And I myself recognize that I don't know everything either. So there's going to be a learning curve for some and figuring out, what are our warm season vegetables? How do we grow really good, wonderful apples on trees? But it's an exciting process. And a good opportunity for us to expand our knowledge to help our producers. We also have a lot of really wonderful tribal efforts going on. A lot of our tribes in South Dakota look at urban practices for food sovereignty and food security. So that's kind of another aspect that we're kind of doing right alongside every other producer. Eventually getting into urban ag publicity. Right off the bat, I was like, let's put specialty growers in the highlight. Let's make a news thing about them weekly. And then I'm like, that's maybe a 5-year project, not a 1 year. But it's a hope down the road that we can get the same type of media exposure for our specialty growers that we do with our soil health voices and our livestock producers. Expanding our technical assistance abilities. Again, goes hand in hand with education. And then probably the best one, adapting and adding practices and payment scenarios. So we've touched upon a little bit with pest management, nutrient management, and fencing. We also do high tunnels. And we can do both your traditional high tunnel as well as your caterpillar tunnels. So something a little bit less structural, a little bit less robust. As long as they meet a 6-foot requirement, we can also be cost sharing those. We can also equip your high tunnel with micro irrigation if we do have a need for irrigating those crops and getting them water. Crop rotation, cover crop, no-till is also something we can look at, cost sharing. Again, everything we do is based on a resource concern. So it's not necessarily a a nice menu that you get to choose from, but a conversation, a field visit to your farm to think, how can we improve your conservation? How can we make this more sustainable for you? It's not an all or nothing either. Everything you do, you can start small. And I've really encouraged starting small with our producers, because when you have 5 acres and you come in and you sign up for crop rotation and cover crop and a high tunnel and micro irrigation, all of a sudden you're going to get very overwhelmed. I know I would. So I recommend saying, just start with a crop rotation, and actually don't even put it on their whole field. Let them try it out on just that corner block. See if it's something that is financially, if they can financially do it, because not everything can be made into a dollar value. See if it works for their rotation for when they're harvesting, and then from there, they can come back. You can have as many applications with NRCS as you want, so there's no need to get everything in one go. Slowly build that foundation, and one day you have a house. With our practices, I will also mention that we have 2 really cool, new, exciting practices coming. They are going to be released next month. So for those that are interested in EQIP, for next year, these are available practices. The first one is low tunnels. So pretty much as it is, a low tunnel, take a high tunnel and micro size it down. A low tunnel for us will be anything under that 6-foot limit. So you can actually have a pretty big low tunnel. But again, it's going to be looking at controlling your pests, season extension, especially during the fall time. It can be something that might be a little bit manufactured yourself. We're not necessarily going to put any strong requirements, but something that, again, providing more accessibility to assistance. And then our second one is going to be raised beds. Just as it says, raised bed, you're building a growing medium above your soil. This practice is going to be very specific to soils that are not suitable for production. So as much as I would love to give everybody a raised bed, we won't be doing that. It will be more of looking at your soil and looking at what its productivity is. Is it high clay? Is it really sandy, or gravel packed? And potentially, is it contaminated that you don't even want to touch the soil? So those are really exciting practices, and I foresee that with USDA, there's going to be more coming down the line. With the Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production, there's a lot of talk about controlled environment agriculture. So hydroponics, aquaponics, mushroom growing, vertical farming, container growing with lights and whatnot. So we're just kind of starting. There's been a fire lit, and it's getting bigger. It might not be there for everything, but I say yet, because I really think that as this develops, there's going to be a lot more opportunities coming, new practices, and just, all in sight, growing more food for the U.S. So much more to come. So, do you have anything?
I think we're out of time.
Okay. Well, thank you. If anyone has any questions, please come up and see me. You can also take one of my cards if you're interested in talking with me later on. My contact information is also here. So thank you all very much.